There's something quietly shifting in the world, something subtle but powerful. For thousands of years, belief in gods was just assumed. It was the default setting, the background hum of every culture. But now more and more people are stepping away from it, and they're not doing it in protest or out of rebellion. They're just walking away quietly, peacefully, and not looking back. The question is, why? Why is atheism, or at the very least, non-belief, growing around the world, not just in Western countries, but globally, even in places where religion has been deeply woven into everyday life? It's not a loud revolution, it's not being driven by charismatic leaders, and it's not something you'll see in headlines very often. But the numbers are clear. The rise of non-religious identity is one of the most significant shifts of our time. And when you look closer, it makes sense, because it's not just about rejecting gods, it's about waking up from something, about no longer needing the answers we used to cling to, about outgrowing ideas that once felt necessary but now feel out of place. To understand why this is happening, we need to zoom in on something that often gets overlooked: the silent discomfort that religion creates for people who are really paying attention. The cracks don't start with some grand epiphany. They start with questions. Little ones, ones that don't go away. Why does an all-loving deity demand worship? Why are ancient texts treated as moral authorities when they contain laws that no modern society would accept? Why do so many religious systems seem obsessed with control, over thought, over behavior, over guilt and shame? These aren't new questions, but in the past they were easier to push aside. You might have been raised to ignore them. We're told that doubt was a spiritual failing, but now the space to ask is wider than ever. The internet, books, podcasts, forums, they've made it easier than ever to explore these ideas without fear. And when people finally start looking, what they find is often surprising. They find out that morality doesn't collapse without religion, that life doesn't feel empty when you let go of sacred beliefs, and that meaning isn't something handed down from above, it's something we build day by day. This is the core of what's driving the shift, not anger, not cynicism, but clarity. As the more people learn about the world, the more they see how belief systems were formed not from divine insight, but from politics, power, fear, tradition, and most of all, uncertainty. Religion was never just about truth, it was about survival. It was about control. It was about filling in gaps we couldn't explain. And as those gaps closed, as science, philosophy, and psychology move forward, the role of religion becomes harder to justify. This isn't about science versus spirituality, it's about whether certain ideas still make sense in light of what we now know. Take the concept of hell, for example, a place of eternal torment created by a loving God to punish finite beings for finite mistakes. When that idea is no longer protected by fear, when you just look at it plainly, it stops feeling like moral justice and starts looking like psychological abuse. And yet, billions of people are taught to believe in it from childhood long before they're old enough to understand what they're agreeing to. That's not a path to truth, that's conditioning. And more people are recognizing that now. It's no coincidence that atheism is rising faster in places where education levels are higher, or where people have access to diverse sources of information. It's not about intelligence, it's about exposure. It's about what happens when you're allowed to think freely, without being told that certain thoughts are dangerous. And once people realize they won't be struck down for questioning, they don't stop. They keep going. They start asking deeper questions, not just about gods, but about the systems built around those gods, the rules, the hierarchies, the rituals, the punishments, and whether any of it actually holds up under scrutiny. This is why the change is happening quietly, because it's not driven by a single moment. It's a slow unraveling, a gentle fading. People don't wake up one day and suddenly renounce their faith. It starts with a small hesitation, a pause, a whisper of doubt. And once that crack forms, it doesn't seal shut again, it grows. And then something even more surprising happens. People feel relief, not fear, not emptiness, not moral chaos, but freedom. Because so much of what religion does is bind people to roles they didn't choose, guilt they didn't earn, and fears they didn't question. Without that pressure, there's space to breathe again, to see the world and yourself more clearly. That doesn't mean all the answers become obvious. It just means the old answers stop pretending to be sacred. They become what they always were: guesses, stories, human inventions. And once you see them that way, it's hard to go back. That's why atheism is growing, not because people are angry at religion, but because they're realizing they don't need it. A lot of this shift starts early, in childhood, but not always in the way people expect. In the past, religion was so deeply embedded into family life, school systems, and cultural identity that questioning it felt like questioning your own roots. In some places it still does. But that grip is loosening. Kids today are growing up with more access to outside perspectives than any generation before them. They don't have to rely on their parents or local clergy for answers anymore. They have entire worlds of information at their fingertips. They can hear from former believers, scientists, philosophers, psychologists, regular people who've stepped away from faith and built lives of meaning without it. And the more they hear those stories, the more normalized it becomes to question. It's not that doubt is new, doubt has always existed, but doubt used to be isolated. Now it's connected. You don't feel alone when you wonder if the stories you were told are true, because someone else, somewhere, is wondering the same thing and talking about it. It's powerful. That's what's fueling the quiet rise of disbelief. Not a war against religion, but a slow erosion of the fear that once protected it. And once that fear is gone, the questions come faster. Why does religion seem so obsessed with obedience? Why is questioning seen as a threat? Why are so many religious communities structured around authority rather than inquiry? The answers aren't always comfortable, because for many religious systems, obedience isn't just a value, it's the foundation. And when you start building your identity around personal agency instead of submission, you start noticing just how much of religion depends on keeping people small. Not deliberately, always, but functionally. If you believe you're broken by nature, you need salvation. If you believe life without God is meaningless, you'll never live. If you believe morality comes only from above, you'll be afraid to trust your own judgment. And for centuries, those beliefs worked. They kept societies in line, they offered comfort in times of fear, they filled gaps in understanding when no one had better explanations. But now we do. Now we understand the origins of morality and evolution and empathy. We understand how social rules and cooperation developed, not because of divine command, but because of practical survival. We understand death differently too. We know it's final, and that makes this life feel more urgent, not less meaningful. The old fear was that if you took religion away, people would fall into despair or chaos. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that people are discovering how to live more honestly. They're building values not out of obedience to ancient texts, but out of thoughtful reflection, mutual respect, and a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. And they're realizing that you don't need an invisible judge to be a good person. In fact, when goodness is only motivated by reward or punishment, it's not really goodness at all. It's compliance. True ethics require freedom, freedom to think, to feel, to question, and to act based on your own conscience. And when people are free to do that, they start to notice how much better it feels than guilt, shame, or fear ever did. That's another reason belief is fading. Not out of pride, but out of relief. Because it's exhausting to live under constant judgment, even if that judgment is invisible. The rise of secularism, of living without religion, isn't about arrogance or nihilism. It's about lifting a weight people didn't know they were carrying. It's about stepping into the world without needing it to be part of a cosmic plan. It's about accepting uncertainty rather than trying to plug every gap with divine explanation. And that shift, while quiet, is massive because it opens the door to a completely different kind of relationship with life, not one rooted in doctrine or salvation, but in curiosity, in experience, in connection with others and with the self. Of course, religion isn't going away overnight. It still holds tremendous influence in many parts of the world, but its dominance is no longer guaranteed. In places where religion once shaped every law, every school, every election, people are beginning to separate faith from governance and slowly from identity. They're starting to realize that not believing in a God doesn't make you empty. It just means you're working from a different set of tools. And often, those tools are more flexible, more grounded, and more compassionate. Because when you no longer believe in a divine plan, you start taking more responsibility for what happens here, now. You stop waiting for heaven and start trying to build something better on earth. You stop fearing judgment and start focusing on understanding. And maybe most importantly, you stop seeing other people through the lens of belief, who's saved, who's damned, and start seeing them simply as human, getting interested. That shift changes everything. It changes how you love, how you raise your children, how you handle death, how you forgive yourself. It's not easy, it's not always comfortable, but it is real. And more people are waking up to it, not because they've been persuaded by arguments, but because the old explanations stopped making sense. Because the rituals started feeling hollow. Because the silence they were told to fill with prayer didn't need filling after all. One of the biggest drivers of this global shift is something we almost take for granted now: connection. For most of human history, your world was your village, your family, your place of worship. There weren't many chances to encounter people who thought differently, not unless they were framed as outsiders or even enemies. But today, that barrier is gone. We don't live in isolated pockets anymore. We live in a web of voices, ideas, questions, and stories from all over the world. And when you start hearing how many people have found peace, purpose, and clarity outside of religion, it starts to feel less risky to reconsider what you've been taught. There's safety in numbers, and suddenly you're not the only one who doesn't believe. You're one of millions. Globalization didn't just change economies. It changed beliefs. It forced ancient traditions to sit next to modern realities. And in that comparison, some of those traditions just don't hold up anymore. A teenager in a highly religious country can now scroll through videos from people who left their faith and are thriving. They can read the science behind belief, how our brains are wired to find patterns, seek comfort, and fear the unknown. And suddenly, the sacred feels more psychological than supernatural. Technology, especially smartphones and social media, turned the whole planet into a conversation. And when religion tries to silence that conversation, it starts to look like censorship, not truth. In the past, religion had a monopoly on meaning. If you wanted guidance, community, or identity, you went to a church, mosque, temple. Now people find those things elsewhere. Through art, philosophy, science, mindfulness, human connection. People no longer need religion to feel a sense of wonder because the natural world is already full of it. They don't need scripture to feel awe because a telescope can give them more than a pulpit ever could, and they don't need a supernatural being to feel loved because that can come from real people who care about them unconditionally. All of this has chipped away at the old foundations, but it's not just technology or culture doing the damage. In many cases, religion is undermining itself. Scandals, abuse, corruption, these aren't rare exceptions. They're patterns. And people are noticing when institutions preach humility but hoard wealth, preach purity but hide predators, preach love but foster division, the credibility collapses. People aren't leaving because they want to sin. They're leaving because they no longer trust the messengers. And when the messenger is flawed, the message stops sounding holy. Religious leaders used to hold enormous moral authority, not because they earned it, but because it was granted by default. That era is ending. Now, authority has to be earned, and religion isn't adapting fast enough. Younger generations are especially sensitive to hypocrisy. They've grown up watching institutions fail, politically, economically, ethically. And when they see those same patterns in religion, they don't feel inspired. They feel alienated. They see through it. That's why you'll often hear people say they're spiritual but not religious. It's a way of saying, I still feel something beyond myself, but I don't trust your system anymore. Even that's a step away from traditional belief. And for many, it's the beginning of a longer journey toward disbelief, because once the rituals feel empty, and the stories feel like mythology, and the leaders feel human, just as flawed as everyone else, it gets harder to keep pretending that this is the only way to live a meaningful life. And when you stop pretending, things open up. That's the heart of what's happening, not a rejection of meaning, but a redefinition of it. Meaning that isn't handed down, but created. Not bound by tradition, but shaped by experience. And not ruled by fear, but guided by understanding. This is also why attempts to revive religion through politics almost always backfire. When religion is forced into public life, when it becomes law or tries to control education, people don't return to faith. They turn away from it. Because belief only means something when it's chosen freely, and when it's imposed, it feels like control. People don't want to be controlled anymore. They want truth, they want authenticity, they want to explore without guilt and ask questions without punishment. And most of all, they want the freedom to walk away without being told they're broken. But that freedom, that simple human freedom to believe or not believe, is spreading, and with it, the number of non-believers is rising. Not because they hate religion, not because they want to destroy anything, but because they want to live honestly. That's all. This isn't playing out the same way everywhere. In some parts of the world, people are free to question. They can explore ideas, reject beliefs, and live without religion, without fear. In other places, that choice is still dangerous. It can cost you your family, your job, your safety, even your life. But here's the surprising part. Atheism is rising even in those places, quietly, carefully, anonymously sometimes, but it's happening. Online communities have made it possible for people to share their doubts. Even under oppressive regimes, people who once felt completely alone are realizing they're not. And that's changing everything. Because even when religion is tightly enforced, belief can't be. You can force behavior, you can mandate rituals, but you can't make someone truly believe something they've already seen through. Once the illusion breaks, it doesn't come back. So while some governments and institutions double down, punishing blasphemy, banning certain books, silencing dissent, the deeper shift continues underneath, a quiet revolution of the mind. And the more people begin to see religion not as a sacred truth but as a cultural construct, the more they start to question what else in their lives was built on assumptions they never agreed to. This shift doesn't lead to chaos, it leads to awareness. In countries where religious identity was once required, more people are starting to say, I was born into this, but I don't believe it. That kind of honesty is powerful, and it's not always about rejecting everything outright. For some, it's a gradual letting go of superstition, of fear, of guilt, until what's left isn't religion anymore, just habit. And eventually even that fades, because without belief the rituals lose their weight. That's not to say belief disappears completely. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures. We're drawn to stories, symbols, and ideas that help us feel connected to something bigger. But increasingly, people are finding that connection outside of religion, in nature, in art, in deep relationships, in the quiet moments that don't need explanation. And when you no longer believe your life is being watched or judged from above, those moments start to matter even more, because they're all you have. And that realization doesn't make life meaningless, It makes it urgent, vivid, real. When belief in the afterlife fades, attention to the present grows. And that's what's at the heart of this global rise in disbelief. Not just skepticism toward gods, but a deeper trust in this life, this moment, this reality. That doesn't mean everyone who leaves religion becomes an atheist. Some become agnostic or spiritual in a loose, personal sense. But the overall trend is clear. More and more people no longer believe in traditional doctrines, no longer accept ancient books as moral authorities, and no longer want to be defined by religious identity. That's a huge cultural shift. Because for most of human history, religion was the framework for everything: morality, family, politics, identity, death. Now, that framework is being questioned from every angle. What's replacing it isn't always neat or unified. There's no single worldview stepping in to fill the gap. But that's actually part of the appeal. Because people are tired of rigid systems. They're tired of being told what to believe, how to live, what to fear. They want room to explore. They want space to say, "I don't know," without being punished. They want to live with questions rather than pretend they have all the answers. And that openness, that humility, is what many find when they step away from religion. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about being honest enough to admit that we don't. And somehow, that honesty feels more sacred than any sermon ever did. So what does this all mean? What happens when millions of people across countries, generations, and backgrounds start letting go of the idea of God? Well, nothing dramatic at first. The sky doesn't fall, people don't turn evil, society doesn't collapse. Instead, something much quieter happens. People begin to think for themselves. They begin to take ownership of their choices, of their values, of their mistakes. They stop outsourcing morality and start building it from within. And that, in many ways, is the most important shift of all. Because when morality isn't tied to fear of punishment or hope of reward, it becomes more genuine. You don't help others because a God told you to. You help them because you see yourself in them, because compassion, empathy, and fairness are part of being human, not divine commands. This is what many people are rediscovering, or maybe discovering for the first time, that you don't need sacred texts to live a meaningful life. You don't need ancient rules to be kind, or honest, or courageous. You don't need belief in an afterlife to treat this one with reverence. And you certainly don't need to believe in sin to know when you've caused harm, or to want to make things right. These are human capacities. We've had them all along. Religion often gets credit for inventing them, but in reality, it just wrapped them in stories. And now more people are realizing that the stories, while sometimes beautiful, aren't required. The rise of atheism, then, isn't the loss of something sacred, it's the return to something real. It's the recognition that meaning, morality, purpose, love don't come from above. They come from here, from the way we treat each other, the way we learn, the way we create, the way we navigate uncertainty with honesty and care. This isn't a new idea, but it's finally becoming a widespread one. And it's happening at a time when we need it most. Because the world is facing problems no prayer can solve, no scripture can guide us through, we need clear thinking, real compassion, and shared responsibility. And that means stepping out of the shadow of dogma and into the light of conscious, intentional living. This shift won't happen all at once. Religion still holds power, politically, economically, socially. It still comforts billions, and for some it still provides meaning. But for a growing number, it no longer fits. It no longer answers the questions. It no longer feels like home. And so people walk away, quietly, thoughtfully, sometimes painfully. But with each person who leaves, the path becomes easier for the next. And the conversation expands, not just about what we don't believe, but about what kind of world we want to build in the absence of divine authority. A world where value comes from what we do, not what we worship. Where progress is measured by how much we understand, not how faithfully we obey. Where freedom means more than religious liberty. It means freedom from religion, too. And where truth isn't something to be handed down, but something to be pursued together. That's the future more people are stepping into. And that's why atheism is rising. Not in anger, but in awakening. Not as a rejection of meaning, but as an embrace of reality. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most human thing of all.